if there's an opportunity to get involved with it, we'd love to do that. I didn't know that that meant a sponsorship, but we actually met in Boston. There was a big conference in Boston called the HubSpot Inbound Conference. We met there, and they told me that they wanted to partner on the podcast. So I didn't know what that meant. After the meeting, I went to ChatGPT and said, please give me a couple of sponsor options. And I pitched it to them. I wrote up an email and said, here's a couple of sponsor options. And I did a small option and a big option. And they started with the small option, but I will say that the small option was still pretty big. We've been partnered together on the podcast. They've been sponsoring it for coming up on 6 months. And the sponsorship is over 5 figures. I can't talk about the exact figure.
I want this podcast to be a masterclass for everyone who's aspiring to be a creative professional or a content creator. And one beautiful thing that we can learn from Andrew is that set goals that are doable, but do not quit before they're not done.
I said I was going to commit to doing 10 episodes, so 10 episode pilot, and then see, at that time I could stop. And so that gave me, that removed a lot of the stakes with how much work it is to get started, because you're saying, hey, this is a 10 episode pilot. We're going to see what happens.
Welcome back, guys, to another podcast. As I told you, I don't know if this is the first episode or the second episode. I'm yet to figure that out. It's probably the first.
It's
one
early.
of the three.
It's in the pilot. It's in the pilot phase.
Yeah, it's in the pilot. So, as you all know, the podcast is about attention economy, and our whole purpose with this podcast is to invite creative professionals, content creators, creative founders, and talk to them about their creative journey and how they're actually winning it in one way or another in the creative industry. Today I have Andrew, who's not only who not only have a really crazy story when it comes to podcasting, but he's also one of my really good friends, and he has been one of my past clients as well. So before I give the mic to Andrew, a thing about Andrew is that Andrew got a sponsorship. Something which we did not get. After 6 years of content creation, he got a sponsorship on his pilot with 0 views and just on the idea. So after you, Andrew, you can share about yourself first. How who you are, what do you do, how did the idea of podcasting came into being, and then you can talk about the story, how the deal was done.
Sure. Thanks, Bilal. I'm thrilled to be here. And yes, we started as. I think I started as a lead for you. Then you were an advisor. You were giving me some ideas about how to get the podcast off the ground. And then I became a customer to you, or a client, because I was able to get funding, to get a sponsorship. And you were one of the first calls that I made after I secured the sponsorship funding, when my podcast was less than 5 episodes in. And truth be told, I didn't know what I was doing. So you were an amazing partner and an advisor to getting how the deal was done, content and video off the ground. I'm really grateful for that. And Bilal, you're also one of the best salespeople that I know.
Thanks, man. Okay, so the cool thing about Andrew is, Andrew is not someone who has crazy number of followings. Andrew is not someone who has been creating content for like 10 years. But the cool thing about Andrew is that Andrew got a sponsor that none of us did on his very first content venture. And we will talk about him. We'll ask him, how did he get that? How did he get the sponsor? What did he tell the client? And how can we get sponsors as well?
For sure. Really appreciate that, Bilal. And yeah, as mentioned, I've been a consumer. So I've been a listener of podcasts for over a decade. I've probably listened to thousands of podcasts. And I thought I was learning a lot from listening to them. I realized after I got started that 90% of it's kind of just information going into your head. Actually learning is trying to start the podcast, trying to get set up with the microphone, the studio, the Riverside, the hosting service, the platform, signing up for Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That is actual learning and will really kind of make you feel like a novice. And you realize that all of the thousands of episodes you've listened to, didn't really teach you what you needed to do. You have to just go out and figure it out. And it was, it's really hard to get started because there's some amazing podcasters and podcast content out there. And you can feel like a novice, like, what am I doing? What content do I have to share? And so it took me a few months to actually ship it. And, I was doing a lot of research and analysis paralysis. And the reason I was able to get it off the ground, there's a modern day philosopher, thought leader, and a friend of mine, an advisor. His name is Paul Millard. And he wrote a blog post called Ship, Quit, Learn. And the idea is when you're starting something new, commit to getting 10 episodes in. So ship out 10 episodes and then give yourself permission to quit. So I didn't say I was going to start a podcast with 25 episodes and thousands of views, which is where we've gotten to now. I said I was going to commit to doing 10 episodes. So 10 episode pilot and then see, at that time I could stop. And so that gave me that removed a lot of the stakes with how much work it is to get started, because you're saying, hey, this is a 10 episode pilot. We're going to see what happens. And I was actually able to talk to folks in my network and get advice from them, what they thought of the podcast, if they liked it, and frankly, if they were interested in being guests. And I was fortunate enough to have a half a dozen friends and colleagues and folks in my network that agreed to be early guests of the podcast before it was proven whatsoever. One of those guests went on to actually become our initial sponsor. And so the way I look at it is it's all about relationships. Sales and life and business is about relationships. And so it's easier to work, your network, they want you to be successful. They're friends, they're partners of you, they're customers, just like we've talked about. Bilal, I've been a client for you. And so you asked me about the podcast. I said, of course, because we know each other. Whereas Bilal, if you'd reached out and we'd never met before, I probably wouldn't join your podcast right now, just because you don't have that relationship. So it's about relationship and start where it's a little bit easier and then go from there.
Yep. So yeah, again, very good. So, again, the whole point of our podcast is to teach, and I want this podcast to be a masterclass for everyone who's aspiring to be a creative professional or a content creator. And one beautiful thing that we can learn from Andrew is that set goals that are doable, but do not quit before they're not done. Okay? So there's a stat that 90% of the podcasters leave before 7 episodes. So he made sure that we crossed the mark of 7 episodes. And that's what content is. You will suck. You will have shit content on the first day, the second day, the third day, maybe the 100th day as well. But eventually, there's a very beautiful saying, you're 100 days short or you're 100 videos short of your perfect video. So you need to get those done. You need to get those out of the way before you get that perfect piece of content. Okay. So let's dive a bit deeper into, not just, you told us that you invited him and he accepted that and he was your friend, but let's go a bit deeper. Tell us about the sponsorship, the worth of the sponsorship, for how much long period was it, and just a heads up for the listeners, Andrew has a really good creative funnel as well, the system, in which we will learn from that as well. But let's take it step by step. Tell us the amount of what was the specific deal was, how much the period and the compensation.
Yeah. So the podcast, the sponsorship, it was really a partnership. And I had been having a couple of conversations with Dan Curran is one of the co-founders of OrgChart Hub. They built a HubSpot specific app for enterprise sales. And so that helps to visualize your complex enterprise deals natively within the CRM software for HubSpot users. And I had previously used OrgChart software to visualize my deals using Microsoft PowerPoint and Google slide decks. And so creating an org chart, who's the president, who's the director, who's the associate, where am I at in the deal, how high up are they, and things like that. And so I had felt the pain of doing it manually, and I thought it was really clever and innovative that they created a CRM app for that. So we had a little bit of a relationship, and we had a
Shout
little
out
bit
to
of
Dan.
shout out to Dan, big shout out to Dan. We had a little bit of a background before I ever started the podcast, and Dan was actually one of the people that I went to and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about this podcast. What do you think?" And I didn't. This was unbeknownst to me, but him and his co-founder Austin, shout out to Austin, they had been big fans of podcasts for a decade. And so when I pitched the idea of, hey, Dan, why don't you come on the podcast? He was like, this is really cool. I've done a few podcasts and I'd love to do this. And then naturally, I think they talked about the idea and they said, if there's an opportunity to get involved with it, we'd love to do that. I didn't know that that meant a sponsorship, but we actually met in Boston. There was a big conference in Boston called the HubSpot Inbound Conference. We met there and they told me that they wanted to partner on the podcast. So I didn't know what that meant. After the meeting, I went to ChatGPT and said, please give me a couple of sponsor options. And I pitched it to them. I wrote up an email and said, here's a couple of sponsor options. And I did a small option and a big option. And they started with the small option, but I will say that the small option was still pretty big. We've been partnered together on the podcast. They've been sponsoring it for coming up on 6 months. And the sponsorship is over. It's over 5 figures. I can't talk about the exact figure, but 5 figures in US dollars.
Oh wow, nice. That's nice. No wonder why you phoned me.
Yeah.
Why you were able to afford me. Anyhow, that's cool. So, so you got a sponsorship basically out of. So what did you pitch them exactly? If someone wants to replicate that, what do you specifically pitch them?
Yep. So that we would do an advertisement, a shout out of their Org Chart Hub app on the podcast, that we would host customers of theirs. And we actually hosted Dan for a couple of episodes. And Bilal has also been on one of the episodes of the podcast, the special edition, holiday edition. And we actually talk a little bit more detail about the deal in that episode. But what we pitched them was, hey, we want to help. Bilal, you're an expert in content. Content, you just never have enough content. So we were giving them content they have over 1,000 customers and they have 5,000 to 10,000 people on their newsletter. And so they're able to inform their network and their prospects and their customers with high quality content related to the service of what they do.
Wow, that's okay. So now that we have got the deal section done, let's come to how did you felt, the first video as a creator. What improvements do you see in your life as a person, who never, I guess you never hosted a podcast, right? Before this,
yep.
Or any video.
Yep.
Yeah. So a person who was a first time content creator with a sponsorship on their head, how did it felt and how did it improve you as a person, and what are the key insights that you got from this experience, which you can share with the people, which can be beneficial?
Yeah. There's a saying, I learned this from David Perel, who's a prolific internet writer, and it's called imitate and then innovate. And it talks about imitate those who have walked before you, who have put content out there. Don't copy what they're doing, but use that for inspiration, for structure, and for how you're going to do your episode. And I need to give a shout out to a podcast by Shiv Narayan, and it's called the Private Equity Value Creation Podcast. And his podcast, it's about a year old now. And I just thought the clips and the trailers and the brand, the look and feel of the podcast was really high quality. So I kind of used a little bit of that for early inspiration, Bilal, and some of the creative that we put together. And it's, super helpful to kind of say, like, this is what good looks like. This is the creative brief or a style guide of what we want to get to. And then you did a really good job of adhering and, guiding our how the deal was done initial content to that to really get us a nice foundation.
Yeah. And one more thing I would love to talk about, because as someone who helps clients, as someone who sells these services, when you're in a creative niche, because creativity is subjective, so you cannot necessarily all the time meet the expectations of the client, So it's really important to set some SOPs up front so that you know that you align on the same thing, which you call quality content, And I have had bad experience as well. I have shared a few with Andrew as well. But there are two types of clients, the healthy clients. There's one like Sean. Sean was someone who introduced me to Andrew, by the way. He gives me the free creative freedom. He's like, go ahead, it's your playground. Play, innovate, experiment, adapt, and repeat the circle. And then there's someone like Andrew, who's really focused on what he wants, and he has a great content system. The way he manages the content and the flow, it's really beautiful. We will learn from him as well later on. So there are two, that's how you do it. Either you tell them your expectations or you give them the freedom. And then there's a third client who doesn't have an expectation, but he doesn't like what you do have to make as well. So there's someone in which you can get in which you can have a bit of gray area. Anyhow, so one thing about Andrew was that he was very specific. He asked me about what I was taught. He always respected my opinion as a creative specialist. He always respected my opinion. He was very flexible. And if there was something which was not able to happen technically, and I convinced him, he was flexible, but he was very specific on what he wanted as well, which is a really good thing. And one thing I really love about Andrew was that I did not have to go back and forth every day, every video with him on how we need to do this, how we cannot do this, because of the beautiful system that he had created. And I would like to ask Andrew himself to explain what the system was.
Sure. So we set up a process in Notion, and it was think of it as like an assembly line or a pipeline. And you have an idea. So everyone has ideas. Ideas are easy. Execution is hard. And so we have a place to park the ideas, kind of in a parking lot. And you can take the best ideas or the simplest ideas, and you want to get them started. So then you do a little bit better job of creating a outline or a preview or some inspiration, some guardrails for what the content is going to look like. You get the raw materials, you get the inspiration, and you prep that. And then we would do a handoff, like a relay race, pass it on to Billal's team. Billal's team would pick it up and do a rough draft, a rough cut. We'd see how it's looking. We'd make a couple of tweaks. And then just a couple of days later, it would show up as the final content in a really streamlined fashion with high-end work. So it was a Kanban board of backlog, like a idea, planning, passed off to Billal's team, first draft, second draft, and then final product.
Yep. And we forgot, and the tools that we used were Loom and Notion.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Canva.
Yeah.
And Canva.
And Canva too. You will explain that further, or should I?
Yeah. So I'm not a creative person. I guess I'm creative. I know what creative ideas look like, but I'm not a designer. And Canva just does a really good job of like allowing me to create rough drafts that can be translated and understood by a creative person like Billal's team and some other creative folks that we work with.
Yep. So it was like that he made a rough storyboard with a few references, and then he loomed me about it so that I do not get, because we have time differences as well. Plus, we both are working professionals, so we do not have time to go on meetings all day and go back and forth on text every day. So he just gave me a 2-minute loom explaining what he did, and then I just gave him a rough draft that is it something which resonates with you? Is it something that you really want out of it? And he's like, yeah, it is. Or, maybe a few things here and there, a few twitches, and boom, we had the final product. In 2-3 days, with no hustle, with no arguments, with no back and forth, and with no delay or anything of that. So which was a perfect roadmap for anyone who wants to manage a team or who wants to manage his content flow. That's the perfect content system you can copy from this, from Andrew. Shout out to Andrew for that.
Thank you. Yep. It's Notion, it's Loom, it's Canva, and then it's high end talent.
Yep. It's silent talent. And it's clarity too. It's clarity. Mm-hmm. Okay. I know that, it will be a smaller podcast in duration because Andrew has to go somewhere as well. He has a little meeting in 5 minutes.
Yep.
So we'll just ask him a few, a last question or maybe a few last questions. Not just questions, but, a few things. Firstly, how was your, experience working with us? Secondly, I told you about my agency. So how do you look forward to that?
Sure, sure. Yeah, it was a great experience. Bilal, you had gave me guidance and advisory and suggestions before I even had a podcast, before I had any content. So you did a good job educating me before we even got started. And you were there once I got the funding, when I secured the sponsorship. So it became a really straightforward process. Throughout, communication was really good. The commitment to quality was really high, and the innovation. We were always trying. We had our foundation, but we were always testing the limits to test out new content as well.
Yep. And one last thing for anyone who's trying to, who has something, who has an idea or an aspiration to create a podcast or maybe a channel, a YouTube channel or whatever, but he's shy, he's someone like us who, whose main thing is not YouTubing, but it's secondary thing. What advice or what inspiration would you give to them? And being a
ship,
part,
quit, learn.
yeah.
Ship, quit,
Yep.
learn. Just minimum viable. Just get started. Talk to your friends. Talk to your network, and get started with folks that you already know, and that's how you get going.
Thanks. So thank you once again, Andrew. This was a relatively slow, but really relatively short, but really productive. Very really productive, really fast conversation that we had. The key is to ship.
Quit, as in give yourself permission to stop. Get to 10 and then say, I'm going to walk away. Once you've got to 4, 5, 6, 7, you're like, hey, I like this. I'm going to keep going. But give yourself permission to stop.
Yep. Keep it. So these were the key elements. And again, your network is your net worth, basically. So always back. You can back on your network. You can back, and it's okay to ask people. It's okay to tell people. Maybe they might be interested in what you have to present. It's okay to always pitch. And it's really important to always explore new things. Even if you have a stable career and everything, it's okay to try. It's okay to explore. And that's what we learned from the story of Andrew. That content is for everyone. Firstly, everyone needs to do content as well, as he told you, that it's really important for grooming and self-development as well. Other than that, you do not need to be a celebrity or a 10,000 follower account to get sponsorship. You need to have a solid idea, a solid basis, a solid plan, and you need to pitch the right person, and you will get the deal done. And that was how the deal was done.
There we go. Wow. Yeah. Link to the podcast in the show notes if anyone wants to check it out and reach out.
Yep. So that was Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, once again. You always have been a really kind brother. As you complimented me earlier that I'm a good salesperson, but my technique is really simple. I make sure that connections are beyond just formal connections. They are, we have a talk every now and then, even if we do not have any transactional value to share. Let's just talk like brothers, like friends every now and then. It's okay to, you don't need to be, you do not need to give something to others, something as well. Anyhow, thank you once again. Lovely talking to you, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Bilal. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.